Hi everyone, welcome to our second session of Office Hours. I'm recording from Amman, Jordan, where I'm here for a few days for the beginning of a longer-term project where I'm having the incredible privilege of meeting with members of civil society in a variety of different sectors, journalists and artists, public health officials, educators, people working with children, with elderly, as well as members of the government, to talk with them and learn from them about the creative projects they're involved in to help strengthen civil society and strengthen the sense of civic community amidst the particular challenges that Jordan is facing as a host to many, many migrants over the years and refugees who have found home in Jordan, but have also then challenged the infrastructure and the capabilities of this generous country. So it's been an incredible privilege to be here. I want to give a shout out to the members of the course who are from Jordan. I'm finding your country incredibly inspiring. It's a beautiful place, both emotionally as well as physically, and it's a real privilege to be here. So turning to our course, though, we followed your posts and have, again, on the behalf of the teaching team, I want to say that we're finding the engagement that you are involved in, both with the material of the course as well as with each other, just incredibly exciting and incredibly inspiring. We're also seeing the power of the diversity of this class manifest in these discussion boards, and I know many of you are speaking explicitly about your appreciation of that diversity and how much you're learning from each other, not only from the diverse perspectives of how people are engaging the material, but also learning from each other from, as you all speak out of your situatedness, to share more nuanced understandings of your own context. And many of those contexts, of course, have been case studies in our course. So it's been fabulous. We're all so excited. We find ourselves kind of lost. We think, well, we'll spend a half an hour, 40 minutes to respond to look at these discussion questions, and we find that we're 2 hours later because they're so compelling. So thank you for that. But let me turn here now. We see that there's been a series of both questions and some not confusion so much, but uncertainty about Galtung's frameworks, particularly his notion of cultural violence and cultural peace. So I want to just use this few minutes here to again try to represent those frameworks and how they fit into the larger frameworks of the course, and then utilize one of the case studies you just finished with to try to illustrate a little bit more the nature of how I see the typologies that Galtung represents and how useful they are to help understand this critical theory way to understand religion. So just a quick summary. Remember, the religious studies foundations, those 4 tenets, are the distinction between devotional expression. The second one is recognition. The first one is distinction between devotional expression and the study or the engagement of diverse devotional expressions. Second tenet, of course, that religions are internally diverse. The third, that they evolve and change, that they're living traditions, and that they respond to and are shaped by cultural, historical context. And then the fourth, so those 3 are pretty clear, pretty self-evident, I think, for lots of people, but they not as clear to represent, but when we hear them, we think, yeah, that makes sense. The fourth one's a little more challenging, that religions are embedded in all dimensions of human experience. Again, I think we know that, and your exercise on monuments and on calendar were terrific. So I think those are pretty clear manifestations of embeddedness. But when we get to the other dimensions of human experience, it's a little more challenging. So that's where Galtung comes in. Aside from the introduction of Galtung as a framework of critical theory, because we're looking explicitly at questions of power when we consider questions, when we look at Galtung's typologies, but also the way that, again, Galtung becomes a lens into understanding the embeddedness of religion, because we see how religions are functioning always and have always functioned and continue to function as expressions of cultural violence as well as cultural peace. And again, to remind you about those distinctions. So for Galtung, again, there's 3 forms of violence, 3 forms of peace, and they're intersecting and feed on each other. They help define one another. Direct violence, of course, maiming, bullying, war, murder, direct forms of violence that we often associate with violence. Structural violence, inequalities that sustained inequality, where some individuals, some groups have access to services and capabilities for not only survival but flourishing. So there's unequal access to those goods and services that create for human well-being. So structural forms of violence where some have more access to those services in a consistent way than others, can be legal again, can be such as apartheid, can be social, such as unequal access to quality education, healthcare, etc. Cultural violence again are the embedded values that are long-term, they're kind of sustained. They're not inevitable, but they tend to be deeply embedded in a society and not easily overturned overnight. Take a process of challenging, where the values, embedded values, make direct and structural forms of violence acceptable and good and even laudable. So again, definitions in that way. So conversely, direct forms of peace are when there is, part of the reason we don't really know what to say when we think about direct forms of peace is because many of us live much of our lives in the experience of direct peace, where we are, even if you just think of it as the opposite of violence, where there isn't killing, there isn't maiming, there isn't bullying, there isn't emotional manipulation, where we have relationships that are mutual, that are about human flourishing, that are promoting dignity, and promoting and respecting the well-being of another, and the manifestation of that in direct ways. Much of our lives are spent in direct peace, and we're fortunate in that way. Structural peace are those pockets of our experiences, and I say pockets because unfortunately there are very few places where there is consistent and sustained universal structural peace. But there are pockets of it where in different communities there's actual equality, and not just the pretense of equality, but actual equality where there is equal access to the goods and services that can promote human flourishing and human well-being and human safety in a given context. So we do have that in pockets, often in neighborhoods, sometimes in larger communities, and we have them in pockets historically. But unfortunately, it's hard to sustain those against backdrops of more persistent, if you will, forms of structural violence, the very persistent ones such as racism, sexism, anti-religious sentiments, the type that, for example, have been sustained around anti-Semitism for centuries. So these forms of violence are challenging to create pockets where there are structural forms of peace within the midst of those, but they do sustain, and they do exist, and they are powerful because they give us a vision of what's possible. And so without those visions, without experiences of structural peace, the notion of direct peace would be almost unimaginable. And then so cultural peace become those values, those embedded values that give structural and direct forms of peace legitimacy, that make them feel right, good, and that are worthy of our aspirations. So a couple just quick examples. Cultural peace is manifest in many of our nation states' founding documents. Even though nation states come out of very complicated histories, many of us know and will continue to see in relationship to colonial legacies. But let's just use the founding documents of nation states to look and say many of those have representations of aspirations that we rarely live up to, but that are embedded as aspirations. Human flourishing, equality, human rights, pluralism, representing again what we hope to be as a people, as a community, as a nation. So cultural peace is often represented in founding documents or mission statements of organizations as another kind of representation of a specific articulation of values that give credibility to structural peace and credibility to direct peace. So in our case studies that we've studied so far, let's just use the example of the mural projects, the murals, let's just say murals in Northern Ireland. During the Troubles, we know that murals were used by quote both sides, even though we know there's diversity within each of these major divisions. But we know that the murals were used by both sides to represent hatred, bigotry, and that further fueled hatred and othering of the opposing side, that gave then further legitimacy to direct forms of violence, and continued to then sustain and encourage and make that violence seem either inevitable, and sometimes even to valorize violence against the other as a form of patriotism or as a form of loyalty to one's community. And those murals are difficult to see. Some of them are devastating, depicting heinous acts of violence that then fuel and energize and anger and spark memories of victimization, of cruelty. So that representation of murals in Northern Ireland is a form of a manifestation of cultural violence, because again, it gives credibility to structural and direct forms of violence. Particularly forms that especially gives credibility to direct forms of violence. So on the other side, we have this remarkable project by our muralists. For those of you who saw the video, and if you didn't, you can still get this concept, I think, by your seeing the peers' comments, but also just I think conceptually you'll understand it. So Devaney and Irvine's projects to join together, these two muralists from both sides of this conflict come together to create a new set of murals that represent a different set of values that are also embedded in these societies. The values of hope instead of despair, the values of respect instead of hatred, the values of peace instead of violence, and not only the experience themselves of doing this together, but the representation of what the visual representation of these values become expressions of cultural peace that again are lifting up values that have always been there but have been marginalized during the Troubles, but now are finding ascendancy, if you will, through these acts, through acts like these two remarkable artists who have stepped out of their roles as antagonists and decided to join together to create these expressions and manifestations of cultural peace that represent a different set of values about a future a future for Northern Ireland that is again a future of harmony, of pluralism, of respect, and of valuing the dignity of all. And so again, these representations become expressions of cultural violence and cultural peace. So it's not that murals are either culturally violent or culturally peaceful, but it's what they represent and the context out of which they come. So I hope that's helpful. And of course, the religious connections with both of these, I think, is probably clearer than the cultural dimensions. But of course, during the Troubles, there were always religious voices that were trying to promote cultural peace, but were more muted or silenced or not as explicit, because the powerful religious expressions of cultural violence were in the ascendancy, had social and political power. And so again, these are not inevitable. They move in this moment of movement, following the peace accord, which itself did not end the antagonisms, but it gave a pause, if you will, ceasefire, literally, allows for some other possibilities, but it's still fragile. And again, if you think of Galtung, the idea around these notions of these two typologies of violence is to remind us that these foundations of value are not inevitable. Violence is not inevitable, nor is peace inevitable. That it takes the actions, the intention, the consciousness of a community of individuals to decide whether one wants to promote what narratives one wants to promote. And so these language of typologies of violence and peace can help give us some tools to discern those nuances in a given cultural and historical moment. So I hope this is helpful. I hope that this explanation is a little more, helps a little clarify some of these challenging concepts. If you're struggling with these concepts, don't feel shy about expressing them. We're following these discussion boards and really appreciate you raising questions where things are still uncertain. And if you are still struggling with any of these concepts, don't be shy to express them, because they're complicated. It's one thing to kind of get them intellectually, it's another to apply them. And that's why we're giving you multiple options and opportunities to explore these ideas in a variety of different settings across the globe. So thanks again for your attention here in this video, and of course for all your wonderful efforts in the class. All of us on the teaching team look forward to continuing to follow your discussion threads and hope that you continue to enjoy and find the material worth your valuable time and engagement. And we, again, are certainly looking forward to seeing your responses to the material ahead. Thanks again, everyone.